and for the first time in 70 years, prepare for the King's speech.
The King with the Queen leaves Buckingham Palace for the state opening of Parliament.
History will be made as Charles settles into his new role in Parliament's golden chair. Can Rishi Sunak stay in his? This week is another chance for the Prime Minister to revive his government's fortunes after taking the stage with a very different wealthy man, talking about the risks of the rise of the robots.
The achievements of this summit will tip the balance in favour of humanity.
But can the Prime Minister's plans get a hearing?
No, I think I was reflecting a widespread view.
When the excruciating details of what went wrong in the pandemic have turned the air blue.
Useless pigs. Morons.
And the massive, dangerous crisis in the Middle East ravages on. Although Labour's position is giving Keir Starmer a headache too.
My focus is on alleviating the awful suffering, whatever the individual positions of members of my party.
So our main question this morning, with so much turmoil, what chance does Rishi Sunak have of being heard?
With a microphone, not a megaphone, the Prime Minister's right-hand man, Oliver Dowden, is here. But nothing straightforward for Labour either. The man who wants to be its next Defence Secretary, John Healey, will be with us too. With the conflict continuing, what could Gaza and Israel's neighbours do to stop the bloodshed? We'll hear from Ambassador Hossam Zaki from the Arab League. And even the music's enough to send shivers up the spine. Sarah Snook exploded into fame as Shiv in Succession. But can she really believe her stardom herself?
I don't know. I try not to acknowledge the fame part of it too much. It's too big. It's too big. How can we, as an individual, do that? It's too much.
Morning, morning. It is lovely to be back, and thank you for the many kind messages you sent while I was away. And thank you to Victoria for keeping the chair warm. But it's lovely to be back here, especially with this trio at the desk. The co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer, Lord Bethell, the Tory Health Minister during the pandemic. Goodness knows there's lots of questions about that after the inquiry this week. And the broadcaster, Piers Morgan, is with us again too. Thank you all very much for being here this morning. The front pages today are a bit of a pick and mix. Let's take a look. The Sunday People says Brits are trapped in hell, saying there are 112 British nationals who are stuck in Gaza. The Sunday Times has a report from alongside Israeli soldiers saying we find a tunnel and blow it up. The Observer claims there's a plan in government to brand anyone undermining the UK as an extremist. But the Mail on Sunday has a very different story, claiming the Tory party covered up for an alleged serial rapist MP. The paper says a former party chairman wrote to the police because he was concerned that allegations had not been properly dealt with. And that's one of the claims in the former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorry's new book, coming soon. But let's start, though, with events in the Middle East. This crisis is into its fourth week. Piers, I know you've been backwards and forwards between the States and the UK this week. What's your take on where things have got to?
Well, look, it's an unbelievable mess. It's horrific. You know, what happened on October the 7th was horrific. I think the scale of the response from Israel, clearly on the civilian toll in particular, is horrific as well. And the question becomes, what is the proportionate response? Now, Israel says that their mission statement is to eradicate Hamas. And we can all understand why they would want to do that. Hamas committed an act of appalling terror on its people. They don't just have, I think, a duty, a responsibility to their people to ensure that doesn't happen again. Only last week, a Hamas spokesman was proudly boasting, we're going to do it again and again and again. So Israel has to defend itself. But clearly, we're all looking at these scenes in Gaza, and your heart just despairs for the poor people of the poor innocent Palestinians. But how do you eradicate a terror group, 40,000 of whom are living amongst the civilian population, without massive civilian casualties?
James, do you think that the UK and US government, who both prescribe Hamas as a terrorist group, do you think their approach to call for this pause, this lull, is the right one? Because it seems that they're kind of impotent, aren't they? It's falling on deaf ears.
Yeah, I'm conscious of how Britain, in particular, has very little agency in this. Where we can, I think, make a bigger effect is on trying to create the coalition to put pressure on Iran. Events in Gaza are horrific, but the main player in all of this is Iran, and the UK can, I think, have a leadership role in trying to bring the international coalition to bring pressure to bear on the sponsors of terrorism. And that's what our role should be. Do
you think that's realistic, Carla, that the UK could take a leadership role in this and actually be a broker?
I think historically the UK obviously has a lot of responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in, obviously not solely, but I do think the UK has a responsibility. And we've seen this week that 3/4 of Brits want a ceasefire, and so I don't think they're being represented well by Conservatives and Labour, who are refusing to call for a ceasefire. There just isn't a military solution to this crisis. It's horrendous seeing the level of suffering of civilians, Israelis and Palestinians. More violence is not going to solve this problem. So the Green Party has been calling for a ceasefire and calling on the UK government to join the growing international, not quite consensus yet, but the growing number of international voices that are saying a ceasefire and a renewed effort towards a peaceful political solution is the only way.
I mean, that's the question. It's all very well calling for a ceasefire, and I understand it. And of course, we want to stop so many innocent people being killed in Gaza. But if you have a ceasefire, what you're really saying is we're going to leave Hamas in power there. And they themselves have been oppressing their people. So I think it's much more complex than simply saying, hey, let's stop Israel doing what it's doing. We can all share a concern about the scale of it, but a ceasefire means Hamas stay in power.
So it is very complex, you're right. But we have to get to a peaceful political solution. That's what everyone wants in the end, right? Okay. And we have to look at how we're going to get there. And although the thought of negotiating with people who don't share our values and who are prepared to make terrorist acts...
You can't negotiate with Hamas, because Hamas's stated objective is to eradicate Israel.
If you look at,
how do you negotiate with people who literally want to wipe out Israel?
But if you look at what happened in apartheid South Africa, in Northern Ireland, in the end it comes down to negotiation. So the question is, how do we get there in the shortest possible time with the least possible
Clear
deaths?
already within a few minutes how difficult this is, and we pick up exactly these points a bit later in the programme with the Arab League discussing what Israel and Gaza's neighbours can do about it. Well, the diplomatic and political nightmare we've just heard about there of the conflict is at front of political minds right now. But it's a big week for the Prime Minister in a very different way. The King's speech, the full-on royal experience where the monarch outlines the government's plans for new laws, is on Tuesday. But does the Prime Minister have a chance of really being able to grab everyone's attention with so much else going on? His right-hand man, Oliver Dowden, the Deputy Prime Minister, joins us today. Welcome back to the studio. Let's start with Brits in Gaza. The Foreign Office confirmed no British nationals left the Gaza Strip yesterday. Can you tell us, though, how many have been able to get out so far and how many are stuck?
Well, good morning, Laura. Yes, it is the case that over 100 UK nationals were able to cross out of Gaza into Egypt through the Rafah crossing. It is very disappointing that the crossing was closed yesterday. We are engaging very closely, and we're hopeful that the crossing will reopen again today, enabling further UK nationals to leave the situation.
And we've been in touch with some of those families. Faris Abu Warda, who's a British man whose wife and kids are stuck in Gaza, they'd been visiting relatives, told us the situation's a disaster. He said, we are disgusted at the British government as they have not been able to help us. What we ask for is safe travel to the border, and we're unable to get it. So what specifically are you doing to help families like his?
Well, first of all, it is a very difficult situation in Gaza, clearly, when you have Hamas terrorists hiding amongst the civilian population and a conflict going on in a very small area. Now, the first thing we're doing is trying to make sure that we get that Gaza crossing, the Rafah crossing, open again, and I'm hopeful we'll make progress on that today. Secondly, we are seeking to have these temporary pauses to allow humanitarian aid in and to get our people out. it's not an easy situation, but I would say that to the person in question, they should be in contact with the Foreign Office. We are in contact with people in country, those people who are stuck in the country, to try and help facilitate them getting to the border and crossing.
So in practical terms, those people stuck in Gaza who may have British citizenship or British nationals, they should be coming to the Foreign Office and asking for help to get out?
Yes, so they should be registering with the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office is in contact with them. And that's the way we identify British nationals, and then we're in contact with them about when the crossing is open. Because, of course, we want to get those people out as quickly as possible, but it has to be done in a safe way.
And the Foreign Office are not the people, to be clear, who are deciding who gets to leave, right?
No, we want every UK national to be able to leave as rapidly as possible. As I say, over 100 have left. I'm hopeful we'll get more out, but clearly that does involve engagement with the Israeli authorities and others, but we stand ready to support British nationals.
And in terms then of Israel and Israeli hostages, can you tell us how many of the hostages who are still being held may have British citizenship or maybe British nationals?
Well, we're going through the numbers. Sadly, a number of British nationals have died, and we've put those numbers out there. But there's still 3 British nationals unaccounted for. Now, I can't say for sure the exact status of them because we don't know exactly where hostages are and what's happening in a very complex situation. That's the same for other nationals and indeed Israeli nationals.
But 3 is the number unaccounted
for?
Well,
unaccounted for. One shouldn't necessarily assume that they are hostages.
Okay. Closer to home, of course, we've seen tens of thousands of people express their concern about what's going on with pro-Palestinian rallies. Now, your colleague, the Home Secretary, said that these marches are hate marches. Is she right?
Yes, I think there is hateful conduct in those marches, and I see that from my own constituents. The hurt that is caused when people stand there chanting from the river to the sea, which is clearly denying the state of Israel, or jihad, jihad. And I think what the other people attending those marches need to ask themselves is, are they inadvertently standing alongside those people that are preaching hate? And I think when you look forward to next weekend, when it's Armistice Sunday, I have grave concerns about a march taking place on that day for 2 reasons. First, this is a moment when the nation is supposed to come together in remembrance of our fallen. I don't think it's appropriate to have marches in that context. And secondly, and of course the police are operationally independent and they need to make the decision on this, I do have worries about, in that context, the level of violence and instability we may see with those marches.
To be clear about what you were saying, as it stands, there are rallies planned for Saturday, which is Armistice Day, and then, of course, the Remembrance Day Sunday services. Are you saying those marches should not happen?
Well, it's operationally a matter for the police. But what I would say is that I do have grave concerns. I have grave concerns about, on that day of national remembrance, the signal that sends, the intimidation that the Jewish people feel right now in this country. And by the way, we shouldn't view this as Jewish people. We should view this as British society. These kind of things, the way you have that chants like jihad, they're an affront not just to the Jewish community, they should be an affront to all of British society. And I think all of us should be calling out that sort of thing. And I think the people who are on those marches need to ask themselves whether they are lending support to that sort of thing.
OK, let's move on to the COVID inquiry. It's been a big event this week with some quite extraordinary testimony. Let's just give the audience a reminder of some of the things that have been said this week, and you might find some of this a bit hard to watch.
You called ministers useless pigs, morons. That woman must be out of our hair. We cannot keep dealing with this horrific meltdown of the British state while dodging stilettos from that.
The things that Mr. Cummings, having seen those messages, it was, it's horrible to read.
It was the wrong crisis for this Prime Minister's skill set.
It wasn't a pleasant place to work.
With hindsight, we were at least a week late. At all points.
No, it's hard to watch any of that and conclude anything other than the government's handling of COVID was a disaster.
Well, it's painful to watch, and by the way, I think it's very painful to watch for the victims of COVID. But what I would say, Laura, is this is precisely why we set up this inquiry in the first place. We wanted to get to the full, unvarnished truth of what happened. And that means taking evidence both orally in that way, and indeed I have given my evidence both in written and oral form. The Cabinet Office has given over 55,000 different pieces of evidence. It's important that we hear...
This isn't about the volume of evidence. This is about what we've heard so far suggests to people that it was terrible.
Laura, this is really important that we are hearing from some people here. There is a lot more evidence to be given, including from the former Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister. And there's a further full array of evidence that's been submitted, whether it's messages and so on. And I think it's right that the inquiry sifts through all of that, determines what's relevant and what's irrelevant, and gets to that picture of the truth of what's happened. And I really trust Lady Justice Hallett, a respected judge, to be able to do that. And then at that point, the government will
But you're talking
respond.
about the process of the inquiry. What I'm asking you about is what we have already heard happened, and including your role. You were Minister of State for the Cabinet Office at the beginning, and part of your job was making sure that the government was ready to deal with big emergencies. Had you read all of the plans that were prepared to deal with a pandemic?
Yes, well, I addressed all of this in the evidence that I gave in over 3 hours of evidence to the COVID inquiry.
So I'm sure our viewers would like to know too. Had you read all of the plans that were prepared to deal with a pandemic?
The way that this worked was we had what's called a lead government departmental model. So the responsibility for planning...
Forgive me, I'm asking a really straightforward question.
Laura, if you wish to know the answer to this question, I have to be able to set out the facts of it, which I did at length to the inquiry. So the model we have is what's called a lead government departmental model, which means that each of the risks that the state faces, from nuclear disasters through to winds and flooding through to a COVID-style pandemic, are allocated to different government departments. Now, the Department of Health had responsibility under that model for pandemic preparedness. The role of me in the Cabinet Office, as Minister for the Cabinet Office, was to make sure that we had a full analysis of all of the risks that were facing the state and the kind of and which department had responsibility for it.
And you're giving us a very long technical answer, and I'd like you to give a straightforward answer to our viewers.
This is a complex area. Within that, and by the way, this is why I gave over 3 hours of evidence on it to the inquiry.
Forgive me, this is a really straightforward question, and
Laura,
our viewers
if you'll just forgive me on this point, right? Within that, there were different responsibilities allocated, even within pandemic preparedness. So, for example, and this is rather difficult language to use on a show like that, excess mortality fell within the Cabinet Office. So all the areas for which I had responsibility as Minister for the Cabinet Office, of course, I was across them.
And had you read all of the plans? That's a straightforward question.
I was across all of the elements that were relevant to me in the Cabinet Office, in the context, but this is crucial, in the context of a lead government departmental model, whereby the Department for Health were the lead department, the Secretary of State for Health was the lead person responsible for pandemic preparedness.
So it sounds, however, like maybe you had good reason not to, but it sounds that you're rather trying to bamboozle our viewers this morning with a very technical explanation of the fact that you didn't read every single part of the pandemic preparedness plans.
I'm not trying to bamboozle your viewers, and I can say to you categorically that as I gave evidence under oath to the inquiry, that I read all relevant parts of the COVID plan. But it has to be viewed, the only point I'm making to you is it has to be viewed in the context that the Department of Health were the lead department ready for pandemic preparedness.
Did you think that the plans you had read were good enough?
Yes, in broad terms, I think that we had the right plans in place. I think some errors were made, and I made those clear to the inquiry. First of all, I think we had an excessive focus on flu pandemic preparedness, and it wasn't really the case that COVID was taken was something that was as high up as register as perhaps it should have been. But that was because the most likely scenario was a flu-style pandemic. So and I'm happy to go through again. I'm just sorry, I gave over 3 hours of evidence, so I'm trying to distill this into a few seconds.
And I'm sure our viewers would like clear answers. Can you give me a clear yes or no answer on this other important piece of evidence that was given this week? The Civil Service head of the Department for Health, Chris Wormald, told the inquiry this week, with hindsight, the first lockdown was a week too late. Yes or no, is he right?
I'm simply not going to give running commentary on the inquiry that's going to get to the bottom of it. No, it is because I think in fairness to the victims and in fairness to making sure this is done the proper way, I gave my evidence. They've given their evidence, more people will give their evidence, and then the inquiry will conclude.
OK, well, plenty of people giving evidence have given strong views this week, but I appreciate that you're not willing to do that this morning. So let's move on. Let's move on. We have a couple more important things to talk about. The government will set out its priorities at the King's speech on Tuesday. The Home Secretary wants to introduce laws to restrict homeless people from using tents. She said it was a lifestyle choice to do so. Do you think making it an offence for charities to give tents to homeless people is the action of a compassionate government?
Well, this government is committed to ending rough sleeping, and that has two elements to it. The first is to make sure we stop the causes of rough sleeping, whether that's alcohol dependency, drug dependency and the other factors. And that's why we've allocated over £2 billion over the next 3 years to doing that. And if we can continue to make the progress we're making, over a third reduction in rough sleeping, it's also the fact that it is responsible for a government to be able to say, if there is rough sleeping, when people could be in a safer place, we shouldn't allow these kind of tent cities and other things to spring up. And that's why we are looking at the kind of legislation that might be necessary to address that.
OK, I'm sure there'll be plenty more discussion of that in the next few days. We showed our audience the front page of the Mail on Sunday a bit earlier. Now, you were chairman of the Tory party when it's alleged the party knew one of its MPs had committed multiple offences, including rape of young women, and didn't act. Now, one of your successors seemingly then told the police. Is that true?
Well, these are very, very serious allegations, and I want to reassure you that the Conservative Party takes them exceptionally seriously. It's very difficult for me to comment specifically on this for two reasons. First of all, the individual isn't named, and secondly, it may be the case that there are criminal investigations ongoing. But what I can say to you is that every single allegation is taken exceptionally seriously. We had an independent investigation process into it. And indeed, if anyone has concerns, they should be taken to the police. And I would urge people to take them to the police.
Is this true, what happened?
Well, I simply can't say because I don't know who the individual concerned is. What I can say to you is that when I was chairman of the Conservative Party, every allegation was taken very seriously and indeed was independent of me because we had an independent complaints procedure. I think that's the right way to address these things.
But if this story is true, does that mean there needs to be another investigation into what went on? There's a suggestion here that the Conservative Party somehow covered this up to protect one of its own MPs.
I don't recognise in any form the idea that we covered up, and I can assure you categorically, it was not the case that when I was chairman of the Conservative Party, I covered up any allegations. What I'm saying to you simply, Laura, is that without knowing the name of the person, it's very difficult for me to be able to give you further information in respect of an unnamed individual. OK,
Oliver Dowden, thank you very much for being with us and for taking questions on a range of issues this morning. It's a busy morning. What did you think of what the Minister had to say? You can let us know. Email us keunssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura K, or of course, there's always tons more information and discussion on the BBC website, and we'll try and share some of your views later in the show. Let's get the views of my panel. Piers, what did you make of what Oliver Dowden had to say this morning?
I wasn't aware we had a Minister for Preparedness for the pandemic. I was hosting Good Morning Britain in that early period of the pandemic, and I remember challenging minister after minister pretty aggressively about the lack of preparedness and about what I felt was a chaotic, clueless, almost clownish way that they were going about handling that first phase of the pandemic. And it got to the stage where, you may remember, Boris Johnson ran into a fridge to avoid being interviewed by us and then banned all his ministers from appearing on the programme for 8 months. They didn't want to be held accountable. And I was told, you should apologise for going too hard on these guys. Well, having seen what's already come out in this inquiry, I'd like to apologise for not going hard enough. It is quite clear that we were not only singularly ill-prepared, and we've had no preparation, but that everything we handled, from care homes to testing, to controlling the border, to PPE, you name it, we were not only not prepared, but the way we executed the attempt to try and combat the coronavirus pandemic was utterly clueless. Well, and I don't care, by the way, whether they're Labour or Tory or Green or Lib Dem or whoever was in charge. They were the government of this country in charge in a massive health crisis, and this government absolutely dropped the ball.
Lord Bethell, you were one of those ministers at the time. You're not in government now, so you're not currently accountable. But you were one of those ministers who, Piers has just said, completely failed. And a lot of the evidence at the inquiry this week suggests that's true.
Well, I think what Oliver was right about is that we had the wrong analysis at the beginning. The doctrine that we inherited was completely off the pace. And that came out in Module 1.
From who? The previous Conservative government?
Yes, sure, right, from the previous administration. And in Module 1, the clinicians... spelled it really clearly. They had gone to the Far East after SARS, they'd seen what had happened, and they didn't change anything when they came back. And that was a catastrophic mistake. It meant that when it came to looking at lockdowns, looking at testing, looking at tracing, looking at closing the borders, on all these key issues, we had the wrong mentality and the wrong approach. And it was a hell of a scramble to catch up and to get ourselves in the right place. And the execution of that was a pretty inglorious affair.
And we've seen that this week in, I mean, you know, sort of horrible Technicolor. It wasn't just that the approach you had at the beginning proved to be the wrong one, not with any malice, you know, esteemed medics had the wrong approach and had to change. But what happened then, this political chaos, poison in government, and people talking about the government sort of imploding, that's on you, isn't it?
Well, I think a lot of people got it wrong. The WHO had it wrong. The Americans had it wrong. Almost every Western
government here
I know, but I'm just saying that there was a big scramble in a lot of places all the way around the world, and it is an unpleasant experience to have these WhatsApps being read out. Can I just reassure you that behind the WhatsApps there was a machinery of government that was effective. If you look, when we come to looking at the submissions, the expert advice, and the huge amount of really hard work, scientific evidence, and collaboration that went into the response, there were some really great work that went on, and some people who had their noses to the grindstone.
We had a Prime Minister who didn't care. We had a Prime Minister who wanted to write a book about Shakespeare, who wanted to work out his divorce, who was worried about curtains in Downing Street. What's quite clear from the evidence so far is Boris Johnson didn't care about this. And then Matt Hancock wanted to play God with people's lives. Boris thought it was just old people, and so on and so on. So what comes through is not only lack of preparedness and poor execution of anything we then tried to do, but actually just a callousness running through the top of government, a heartlessness, a lack of interest in the fact that thousands and thousands of people were dying every day. And it was a complete disgrace. And the idea that people like Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock are now off making millions of pounds off the back of this catastrophic failure of leadership in this crucial moment for the country, I find even more sickening.
James,
now, Boris is now making millions. Matt Hancock appearing on every TV show going.
James, what do you
How
say
they have
to
the
that?
gall to do that? I mean, it's shameful, isn't it?
Well, I agree with you that our response was slowed by the struggle we had to get Downing Street to focus on the pandemic. And I have spoken already, quite personally, about my frustrations. And that definitely slowed us down, for sure.
But is it fair to say that the politicians behaved badly?
I
the
think
politicians made mistakes, and then, Carl, I want to come to you.
I think that there was a lot of good intent, and a lot of politicians behaved extremely well. I think Boris, in particular, found it difficult to make tough decisions and to stick with decisions.
Who's the Prime Minister?
I know, and we had a leader who was not suited to that role, and that did, for sure, slow us down.
Carla, what have you made of what you've heard?
I think the inquiry has confirmed what so many of us already feared, that we had the wrong people in the wrong jobs in government at this crucial time. And I think one of the themes that has come out of the inquiry so far too is it's really demonstrated extremely clearly the kind of problems you get when you don't have diversity amongst decision makers. We've seen from some of the statements that have been made to the inquiry that poor decisions were made, problems weren't anticipated because there weren't very many women decision makers in the room, so there were mistakes made around the kind of PPE that was used, for example. There was not a single person who'd ever been on free school meals in the room, so they didn't think through how that might play out. And this is the point I always make, that having a diversity of decision makers at all levels of government isn't just good for the inherent good of being a place where merit is rewarded and where it doesn't matter what your background is, but because it results in better decisions being made.
But do you have any sympathy, though, with the people in Whitehall and the people in government at that time who were trying to scramble with this completely enormous crisis? They'd inherited, or they had the wrong plans to deal with it, and then so much was unknown. Do you have any sympathy with them at all?
Of course it was challenging, but the test of a leader is in how you respond to a crisis. And from what we've seen so far, Boris Johnson and others missed opportunity after opportunity to make the right decisions.
We're saying some of the main players are yet to give their own evidence, so there might be some more kind of blockbuster days at the inquiry.
And there were some women in that cabinet who actually were clueless too. I interviewed some of them. The care homes minister, for example, utterly clueless. So the idea that you just put a lot of women in there and it would have been different, it
I
sounds
don't think
nice.
it's the only solution, but I think that it helps make better quality decisions.
I just think
but
that, honestly,
I'm
sorry, I just think that's such a trite thing to say. I don't think it's about the gender of the people there, it's about the calibre of the people there. It's not about whether should there be more women or more people to tick boxes. You know, like I say, I interviewed some female ministers and they were just as clueless as the men. This was a collective failing by the highest level of our government when we most needed them to be on their game. I'm going to repeat this one more time, but the idea that the key architects of this failure are now out there making millions is a disgrace.
I agree with you.
Well,
on
Cara,
that.
let's talk a bit about your party, because
Sure.
we don't often have the Greens on the show. So you did very well in the local elections last year. How are you going to translate that into the general election?
Well, more of the same. We've done really well, not just this year in the local elections, but in the last 4 local elections, we have more than quadrupled our number of local councillors across England and Wales. And so now we're aiming to do the same at a national level. We've got 4 target constituencies, 4 brilliant target candidates, including myself. Maybe I shouldn't call myself one of the brilliant target candidates, I don't know. But yeah, we're having quadrupled our number of councillors. We're now aiming to quadruple our representation in the House of Commons, and we've got a plan to do that. And it's great to see voters coming to us really, you know, in a variety of different areas across the country and from a variety of different places on the political spectrum.
It's interesting, though, that we know that voters' concern about climate issues and environment issues is high and is growing. And yet, in terms of your polling, you're not really translating that into a big surge for Green support.
Well, our polling has been steadily increasing. There was one recently that had us level with the Lib Dems, I think. And people are coming to us, as I say, recently because of climate issues, yes, but also because of our approach on a fairer taxation system, for example, on tackling the housing crisis. That was one of the key themes in our party conference a few weeks ago. A fairer, greener homes guarantee, which ensures that everyone has a good quality, affordable, warm, secure home.
And just briefly, let's get the crystal ball out. If it's the case that Keir Starmer has the most seats at the next general election, but not a majority, would you help him out and do a deal?
I would be prepared to, but I won't be handing over any unilateral gifts. It'll have to be a negotiation. And my red lines would include, of course, good policies on climate, but also a proportional voting system so that we don't end up in this situation over and over again.
Very interesting. Well, crystal balls are often deemed to be extremely unreliable, but it's fun to get them out every now and again. All 3 of you, thank you very much indeed for now. Now, let's turn back to the situation in the Middle East we've been discussing. The death of civilians in Gaza has been called a heinous, bloody massacre by the Arab League of States. The League represents 22 in North Africa and the Middle East, including Palestine, which the League regards as an independent state. And it includes Israel's neighbours, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon and Egypt. So how could they fix this dangerous mess? Earlier, I spoke to Ambassador Hossam Zaki, who's the League's Assistant General Secretary, and he told me the solution has to be political.
If this is about implementing a security solution, one that Israel has tried time and again, or so it claims, to impose on Gaza, impose on the Palestinian people, then it's not going to work. Nothing will work except a political solution.
But for there to be a political solution, which of course the vast majority of people would want, does there not have to be, for Israel, some kind of change, some kind of ability to get rid of the threat to their people from Hamas? I mean, do you at the Arab League condemn what Hamas did on October the 7th?
The ministers of foreign affairs of the Arab countries have all, most of them, adhered to a resolution that they have adopted several days after October 7th, October 11th actually. And they have condemned the targeting of civilians on both sides. That is as far as anyone in this region is able to go in terms of condemnation. Why is that? Because I'm afraid on the other side, the West, the United States, Europe, mainly, are not in a position to condemn what Israel has been doing, not before October 7th, not after October 7th.
You repeat, though, your call there for a political solution, but do you really expect Israel at this stage, given what happened on October the 7th, to be able to say they would talk to Hamas, they would talk to people they see as terrorists, a group that other governments like the UK and the US see very clearly as a terror group, who carried out all sorts of hideous acts on October the 7th?
Before signing the Oslo Accords, the PLO was identified as a terrorist group by the West, by the United States, by Israel. And then suddenly peace was done with the PLO. Peace was possible. We're looking at the political horizon. We're looking at a political exit of such an intricate problem. The occupation has plagued the Palestinian existence for more than half a century. We need to put an end to that. This is the only way to put an end to violence, to put an end to violence and counter-violence. This cycle of violence needs to stop. The name, the adjective of terrorism has always been designated to the Palestinians, the Palestinian resistance, actually. Some of this resistance are acts that are simply undefensible and really very, very difficult to defend. It's true, but also most of what the Israelis are doing, not only in Gaza now, but look at what is happening in the West Bank. Some of the practices they have been doing are Abu Ghraib-like practices. This is unacceptable. And this is all under the guise of what? Self-defense, an occupation that is trying to defend itself against the people that it oppresses. If all of the international community, with the United States that has so much power, that has such a very distinguished relationship with Israel, if we all put our hands together, then we can get somewhere. But if we all continue to talk in terms of let us address this as a security problem and a security problem only, we're not going to get anywhere. We will have another one. In 1 year, 2 years' time, 3 years' time, the problem will continue to exist.
Ambassador, you talk there of the plight of Palestinians trapped in Gaza. Why doesn't Egypt then open its border to many more refugees? We're speaking to you from Cairo.
Egypt is a country that hosts, as we speak, it hosts about 9 million foreigners. Most of them are refugees. Most of them are refugees. It's not a country that shies away from hosting refugees, not Palestinians nor any other nationality. But this is not the issue. The issue is whether Egypt is going to accept on an Israeli plan that is designed to empty the Gaza Strip from its inhabitants. This is the whole question. And Egypt, obviously, and for obvious reasons, is not willing to take part in such a plan.
Well, sticking with the Middle East, by and large, Keir Starmer agrees with the government's line, which is to call for a pause in the fighting to allow aid into Gaza, but believing that Israel has the right to defend itself against the actions of Hamas, designated a terrorist group on both sides of the Atlantic. But there is unease in the party about that approach, serious unease. John Healey is the Shadow Defence Secretary and he joins us this morning from Leeds. Thank you for joining us, John. There's been a series of very controversial strikes by Israel in Gaza, including reports of a strike on a school, a UN-run school, and on the refugee camp. Do you believe that Israel is acting within international law?
Heartbreaking, these images and the strikes, and more must be done to alleviate the suffering in Gaza and also reduce the level of civilian casualties. And it really is for Israel to explain how its targeting is consistent with international law and consistent with doing everything it can to reduce civilian casualties.
But do you believe they are? I mean, your leader, Keir Starmer, said this week a whirlwind of understandable emotion and rage from Israel mustn't let them forget that Hamas and not Palestinian citizens are the enemy. Do you think there is a danger of Israel going too far, perhaps far too far?
There is a danger of Israel going too far, and more steps need to be taken to protect innocent lives, but it's also important to remember the unique complexity and difficulty that Israel has in trying to take out Hamas, who hides its fighters, its weapons, its command centres, its ammunition stores among and beneath civilians. But the right to self-defence is not a blank cheque, as Keir Starmer argued this week, and Israel must meet its obligations under international law.
But do you think it is doing so right now, though? This is critically important.
Well, look, I'm reluctant. Politicians are not commentators. I'm reluctant to pass judgment on specific actions. There is a proper process for coming to those judgments. In war, information is always partial, it's often incomplete, and it's certainly uncertain. So those judgments will be taken in time, and they'll be taken in line with the established international process through the International Criminal Court and the United Nations. For now, the onus is on Israel to say, this is the way that we are targeting Hamas fighters. These are the steps we're taking to reduce the innocent Palestinian victims. But also, we want to see more done to restore the basic services to civilians in Gaza. There's got to be more aid, humanitarian aid to help. And then Israel's got to do more, take steps to reduce the loss of innocent lives.
Beyond that, Keir Starmer has been among many leaders this week saying there must be a renewed focus on finding that two-state solution, which it is a long time since that looked like a practical or realistic political outcome. How would you concretely actually make that happen?
Well, David Lammy, as our Shadow Foreign Secretary, has been out in the Middle East talking to Arab nations this week, and that's been part of his conversation. Keir Starmer was making an argument that, frankly, we've not heard for many years, an argument like the Arab League have made, which is that, in the end, a political solution, a two-state settlement with an independent, sovereign Palestinian state and a secure Israel is the only way to bring both justice and lasting peace. And he's argued quite rightly that that's been put in the too difficult box by the international community for too long. It's been too easy to ignore the fact that Israel has been extending settlements in the West Bank against international law, and too easy to overlook the fact that Hamas, on Israel's border, is a group that is dedicated to killing Jews and annihilating the state of Israel.
So the West has been guilty of looking the other way, not paying enough attention.
Indeed, and that was the argument that Keir Starmer has made, and he's dedicated a future Labour government, if we win the election, to fight for that cause, to launch a new push for peace, and we'll do that alongside the international partners that are willing to work with us.
There is, though, a lot of unhappiness in your party about the approach that Keir Starmer has taken. And this is not just from people who are on the left of your party, not just from people who might be part of the anti-war movement. Even Anas Sarwar, who is the Scottish Labour leader, a fellow traveller of Keir Starmer, someone who's seen as a sort of young, up-and-coming talent in the party, said in leaked comments got by the Daily Record newspaper, said humanity and empathy is, if we are being blunt about it, that has been missing from some of the statements, which has caused so much of the hurt. Now, that is a senior figure in the Labour Party suggesting that Keir Starmer's approach has damaged your party's standing with the Muslim community and caused hurt.
This has caused hurt and anguish to many people, not just those in the Muslim community.
But he's talking about Keir Starmer's approach causing hurt. We can all see why this conflict would cause hurt on all sides. To any human being watching the images would feel hurt witnessing it. But he was talking about Keir Starmer's approach to this causing hurt to Muslim voters. Do you accept that criticism?
I accept that it's caused hurt to many people, and Keir Starmer would do that as well. But he understands why people are calling for a ceasefire and want to see an end to the fighting. His concern is twofold, and he says that at present this is not the right time for now. First, because Israel must have the right to self-defence. It must have the right to go after the Hamas fighters and its missile launchers. And secondly, in the end, what's most important now is what will best work to bring some alleviation of the suffering to people in Palestine, get more aid into Gaza and create more space for further diplomacy. And that quite clearly has been the humanitarian pauses that Keir Starmer has been arguing for, a break in the fighting, if you like. And it's what the United States has been arguing for, it's what the European Union has been arguing for. And perhaps today we see the first signs of some hope with the Israeli Defense Force saying that later on today there should be a 4-hour break in fighting to allow people to move more safely to safer areas in Gaza. We've got to build now on that.
There is a major march backing Palestinians planned for next weekend on Saturday. And then, of course, that's Armistice Day. And then Remembrance Sunday is a hugely important day. A few minutes ago, the Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, told us he had grave concern about next weekend's plans. Do you think those marches should go ahead?
We're balancing, aren't we, in this country of ours, the right to free speech, the right to protest. But it's utterly unacceptable if any protest starts to disrespect or interfere with remembrance services, or indeed the 2-minute silence on Saturday. But this will be a matter for the police to decide. The indications of the discussions they're having with the protest organisers for next weekend, those who want to march in protest and in support and solidarity of Palestinians, that march will take place later, well after the remembrance service at the Cenotaph, and will take place in a different part of London. And I think that's the way, I hope, we'll see this handled.
OK, John Healey, Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary. Always good to have you on the show. Thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning for some more of that important and serious conversation about what's going on in the Middle East. But now for something completely different, a bit of light relief, because every now and then a TV show comes along that blows its competitors out of the water and its characters explode into stars. One of them was Shiv Roy, the dastardly plotter daughter of the fictional billionaire Logan Roy in the series Succession. She was played by the glorious Australian actor Sarah Snook. Now her next challenge is playing all 26 characters in a stage version of the Oscar Wilde novel The Picture of Dorian Gray in the UK next year. We talked on Friday about why that Victorian classic has lessons for now.
A portrait gets painted of a young man and it's very beautiful and he wishes that he will remain always like the portrait and the portrait to age rather than he does. And I feel like that's like Instagram now, you know, like that's like we take a photo of ourselves, we put filters on ourselves, we're constantly trying to preserve this image of now, but making now the future as well. There's a real sense of celebration of youth and a sort of desperate clinging to youth in some ways. I feel like that's what Wilde was talking about back in Victorian era. There's kind of a bookend from then to now, I think.
Do you feel that that pressure as an actor and as someone who lives your life, at least in part, publicly?
Totally. Oh yeah, absolutely. And but I would say that like I actively try and draw a line with that. I'm very quiet on social media. I find it a bit of a scary landscape.
Has that been a difficult thing given that you are now enormously famous?
Yes and no. And I think because I don't believe that, or I don't engage with that, or I don't know. I try not to acknowledge the fame part of it too much. It's too big. It's too big. How can we as an individual do that? It's too much.
That's so interesting though. So you don't believe you're famous?
I have had hint of it, but I don't want to indulge it, or doesn't make me comfortable.
Now, in the telling of the story on stage, you are playing all of the characters, 26 of them.
Yeah.
I mean, how on earth do you go about that as a performance?
I mean, tricky, but a lot of fun. I just love putting on voices and characters and pretending to be other people, and then, you know, went and got a degree in pretending to be other people, and so it becomes a job. And I hope to be able to bring that to this play, this performance.
And you are doing lots of accents, aren't you?
Yes. So, well, you have to delineate between all the different characters, yeah.
So tell me about some of them and which one's your favourite, which is easiest, which is hardest. Because I think also some of our viewers might not even know that you're Australian. Your accent might be a surprise to some people.
I mean, yeah. And one of the characters, the narrator, will be somewhat similar to my accent now. Maybe a little bit anglicised, more like British, a bit. There's Scottish as well.
And which is the hardest, do you think?
Scottish, I think, is the hardest.
Can I tempt you to give us a flavour of the accent?
I mean, I can hear you also. I'm like, no, too terrifying.
You're going to have to do it on stage.
I know, but I will have practiced and rehearsed and sat, listened to my audio tapes and really worked on it. I mean, if you give me something to say, I could copy.
Okay, say the picture of Dorian Gray.
The picture of Dorian Gray. Is that right? Is that okay?
I think that was not bad.
The picture of Dorian Gray. Yeah. I mean, it's such a beautiful accent. I wish I could do it perfect. I mean, I will do it perfect on the day.
You are the latest in a really big trend of incredible film actors who are going on stage in London. And there has been, a bit of sniping about whether it's really fair for these big stars to come and gobble up roles that would have traditionally gone to theatre actors who earn a living, earn a crust by working in London and other UK cities on the stage. What do you say to that?
If it brings more people to the theatre where someone might go, oh, you know what, I know that person, I'm going to go see a show because they're in it, and then they have an extraordinary community experience where you all sort of sit in the dark of a theatre and watch something amazing, and then they go, you know what, I really like theatre, I'm going to come back again, then there's a purpose to it. There's a reason that's not so bad.
There is tension too in the industry really broadly now with the actor strike in Hollywood. What's your concern about what's going on? What would you like to see in order to resolve that?
I mean, the main thing for me really that I find terrifying is the AI of it all. It's just such uncharted landscape, and we need pretty stringent rules in place in order to protect not just the acting industry, but across the board. If we can set a precedent for other industries in regards to how AI is utilised, then that'll be huge. I think all the deepfake stuff that's already readily available is terrifying. That guy who does the Tom Cruise videos, it's uncanny. And so imagine then having a company who owns your image, owns your voice, creating whatever propaganda at the worst. There are no words that would describe how important this is right now to attend to.
And because of the strike, I know we can't talk in detail about the huge show that you were in, but can you tell us though what the sensation of being in something that is an explosive hit is like? Do you ever have a concern that you'll never love anything as much again?
Totally, absolutely. Yeah. And again, I mean, so the strike, in some ways, have been protected from the come down in a way, just because I've been absolutely not working, and that's totally fine. I have to support the strike. But the fear that rests there is that when we do sort of are allowed to resume and we do get back into it, that Succession will have set this enormously high bar that I will either be like, oh, well, I mean, for me at the moment, it's like, great, I get to do, I get to work on a Wildian text. That's like delicious to work on. So, hopefully something amazing will come up.
Do you miss Shiv?
I mean, she's nothing like me. No. A lot of fun to play, but happy to put her on the shelf and let her go.
I think lots of people miss Shiv, even if Sarah Snook does not. But it's been a busy hour for us here this morning. And we began by talking to the Deputy Prime Minister, Oliver Dowden, about the events in Israel and Gaza. And we asked him whether he agreed with the Home Secretary that there should be no pro-Palestinian marches on Armistice Day.
I have grave concerns about a march taking place on that day for two reasons. First, this is a moment when the nation is supposed to come together in remembrance of our fallen. I don't think it's appropriate to have marches in that context.
What you said was Anton said he thinks it's fine to protest on Armistice Day. But Andy Howells told us he thinks the government, on a different subject, did do a lot to protect the country during COVID. That was something else we talked to Oliver Dowden about, and we've been discussing with our panel. But Abdul said he thinks Oliver Dowden does have responsibility for what he thinks were mistakes during pandemic and that he has things to answer for. We've talked about a lot this morning, you three, haven't you? And I don't know if you are Succession fans, but one of the really interesting things that Sarah Snook picked up on was artificial intelligence. And the Prime Minister was talking about AI this week and appearing in a very chummy session with Elon Musk, who of course is a very controversial figure. James, as a Conservative, do you think that's the kind of thing that actually might shake the government's fortunes out of the doldrums, or does it look a bit odd?
Well, I admire the Prime Minister for doing something that's going to have no impact on his electoral dimension in the next election. I mean, he's doing it because he thinks it's the right thing. I have grave doubts about the way Elon Musk runs social media. I wish the Prime Minister had given him more scrutiny, more challenge on the dire state of Twitter, X at the moment. It's had a huge impact on our children's mental health. And I'd like to see our leaders and politicians not just doing the kowtowing, but also holding them to account.
So do you think he was kowtowing to Elon Musk?
Well, he was being charming and he was pursuing the AI summit. That's exactly the right thing to do. It's always tricky to balance these things, but I'm hard over on giving Elon Musk a hard time.
That's interesting. And do you think, I mean, you say there that it won't give Rishi Sunak a single extra vote. Piers, do you think that actually Rishi Sunak is just always going to be completely hamstrung by the mistakes that happened before him, being the Tory Prime Minister after 14 years in charge? You know, we've seen lots of different ways where he's trying to sort of shake that off, whether it was the AI summit or his relaunch at the conference. But do you think any of it will work?
Oh, it's really difficult because, you know, they're reaching a kind of end game, the Conservatives, where a lot of people are going, you know, just for the sake of it, let's have a change. And he has to try and deal with that. He's got a year left before another election. As we know, anything can happen in that year, so it's not too late. I actually like the thing with Elon Musk. I think AI is the biggest thing in the world right now, outside of the appalling wars which are raging. The biggest thing is AI. It's a force for tremendous good, incredibly exciting. Well, if you actually watch that interview, Elon Musk talking about what is likely to happen here with AI, the speed that it is accelerating. You know, it took me back to, I did the last television interview with Professor Stephen Hawking, and I asked him, what is the biggest threat to civilization? And he said, when artificial intelligence learns to self-design. And I think, you know, Elon Musk is absolutely right to put some warning bells out there. If this gets out of control, we could all regret it.
It's something we've talked about a lot in this studio. Carla, final word to you. I mean, do you think that AI is something that we all need to be spooked about?
I think AI has the potential to bring us great benefits in things like health screening, but there's also a risk with the deep fakes and the potential implications that could bring for our democratic system. And so it's really important that it's regulated. My fears are that with the conference that we had this week, they're going for regulation that is too light touch. So Greens think, for example, that AI needs to identify the products that it has made. So, for example, with a watermark on images. And I think that would address some of the concerns that Sarah brought up as well.
OK, well, it's a complicated area. We've talked about it a lot in the last few months, and I know we're going to be talking about it a lot in the months to come. All three of you, thank you so much indeed for a lively 60 minutes here at the desk. Thank you very much. Among other things, we've been trying to work out what the chances are of Rishi Sunak getting a hearing and impressing you in the next few days with what will be King Charles's first King's Speech. And if it goes wrong for him, well, it might be Rishi Sunak's last. But with the all-consuming other events, that conflict in the Middle East, issues around AI, it may be hard to create the space for Rishi Sunak's number 10. And the embarrassments of the COVID inquiry keep serving up memories of a time for the country that was so difficult and when so many things went wrong for the former Conservative government. Of course, it stirs up memories for every one of us who lived through it all. It is always impossible for Prime Ministers to control everything, but maybe Rishi Sunak is profoundly hampered by the weight of what went wrong before. That doesn't mean everything's straightforward for his rivals in the Labour Party, but even some cabinet ministers fear the chances are tiny of Mr Sunak being able to escape the problems of the past. I'll be with Paddy O'Connell in a minute. There he is, saying goodbye to his guests on Radio 4. Oh, his guests have all gone, but he's waving to all of us. That'll be on today's edition of Newscast. We'll pop up on BBC Sounds later. And of course, you can always catch up with anything on the iPlayer. But thank you so much for your company. I'll see you next week. Same time, same place. Goodbye.